Good evening, dear traveler, and welcome to a journey through the hush of early space history. Tonight, we will drift gently back to the twilight of the 1950s and 1960s, a time when human eyes first gazed in wonder at the world beyond Earth's atmosphere. Imagine lying beneath a wide starlit sky, the air cool and still. The darkness is softened by the faint glow of distant cities and a single star that suddenly pulses with steady beeps. That star is not a star at all, but a man-made satellite named Sputnik 1, the very first human object to circle our planet. In this calm narrative, we will revisit that quiet dawn in 1957 and the remarkable sequence of events that followed. From a humble metal sphere and a brave dog through the first human orbit, all the way to the great dreams of a lunar voyage. Though these feats were the product of intense competition, we will tell their stories with soft language and peaceful pacing, as if reading a bedtime tale of humanity's earliest steps into space. Let us begin our tranquil voyage. Take a deep breath and let your mind slow down. The world of decades past unfurls like a gentle dream. Picture the vast Russian steppe, bathed in silver moonlight, and at its center the desolate expanse of the Tyuratam Range, now Baikonur Cosmodrome, in the Kazakh plains. A single launch pad stands illuminated under flickering lights. In the quiet before dawn, on the 4th of October 1957, Soviet engineers made final checks on a simple satellite. It was a polished metal sphere about 58 centimeters across. With 4 antennae jutting into the cold air, this modest sphere carried a tiny radio transmitter. When they unleashed it on that October morning, the sphere ascended slowly on a plume of fire and smoke. The world held its breath. As it climbed, and the sky eased from midnight blue to an inch of pink at the horizon, Sputnik 1 settled into orbit and began its journey around Earth. Its radio pulses, like distant Morse code beeps, were faintly heard by radio operators and scientists around the globe. For 3 weeks, the beeps rang out, carrying back information about the upper atmosphere. In total, Sputnik 1 made about 1,440 circuits of Earth, traveling roughly 70 million kilometers before its batteries died, and it fell back through the atmosphere on January 4th, 1958. This unassuming satellite had a monumental impact. It shocked the world and officially began the space age. Despite the excitement it caused, Sputnik 1 itself was almost gentle in its simplicity. There were no cameras aboard, no astronauts, only that soft, steady radio pulse. Yet the news of its existence swept across continents. In the West, it sparked a sudden urgency, often called the Sputnik crisis, to catch up. Still, on that quiet night under the stars, many people simply listened and wondered. Historians note that the Soviet announcement was so unexpected that leaders in Washington and others had not fully believed it until they heard Sputnik's actual signal. For now, however, let us stay in the silence of that moment. Imagine yourself there, on a cool terrace or porch, staring up at a moving star, hearing nothing but a distant beep, beep, beep. Let its rhythm be soothing and steady. All is still in the mid-century Russian night, except for that tiny satellite carrying with it humanity's first ambitions to the heavens. Laika, the brave canine cosmonaut, Just 1 month after Sputnik 1, in the waning days of 1957, the Soviets quietly prepared another payload. This time, the object was not just metal, but a living creature. On the 3rd of November 1957, another launch occurred. The rocket carried Sputnik 2, a larger satellite built to test life support systems, and aboard it a small dog named Laika. By many accounts, Laika was a stray picked from the streets of Moscow for her calm demeanor. In the pre-dawn hush, the countdown reached 0, and the engines ignited once more. Under a sky streaked with dawn's light, Laika and her capsule were lifted into orbit. This event, too, was a first. Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Space historians note that on November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union lofted Laika aboard Sputnik 2. Although Laika was not the first animal in space, fruit flies and earlier Soviet dogs had flown on brief suborbital flights. She was the first to circle the globe. For the next several hours, as Sputnik 2 coiled around the planet, Laika's life support system allowed her to breathe and drink from a special setup, and her vital signs were monitored by engineers. She sent back telemetry signals through her little headset. In some of those orbits, Laika glimpsed our blue Earth below, a fragile globe born out of darkness. Of course, Laika's story had a sad end. The scientists had not planned for a safe return, and after several hours, Laika died from overheating and stress. In this calm telling, we note this as a part of history's path to understanding spaceflight physiology. Despite the tragedy, later studies found it was still technically valuable. Laika's flight proved a living creature could survive launch stresses and initial weightlessness. Her memory was honored in monuments and stories, but for us now she also serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made in the pursuit of knowledge. Imagine a small black and white dog in the soft green glow of her capsule's interior light, staring out at Earth as it gently rotated beneath her. Even though Laika's heart stopped long ago, let her courage lull you. She carried our species' dreams into orbit so softly, like a puppy tucked under the stars for the very first time. The first human in space, Yuri Gagarin's gentle orbit, the next giant leap, occurred on a crisp spring morning a few years later. The competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, often called the space race, had only intensified since Sputnik. Both superpowers quietly raced to send a human beyond Earth. In the ASA-8 Soviet camp, their seasoned lead designer Sergei Korolev oversaw the Vostok program. Finally, on April 12, 1961, the quiet of dawn was broken by the launch of Vostok 1. A new rocket lifted a tiny capsule, and inside was a young pilot named Yuri Gagarin. Hours before, Gagarin had trained for this moment. Now he became the first person to set foot, or rather orbit, in space. Reading from the historical accounts, on April 12, 1961, Gagarin's spacecraft was launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome. Within minutes, Gagarin was rocketing into the great dark above. The first human spaceflight consisted of one single orbit around Earth. Like a leaf on a wind, Vostok 1 arced high over mountain ranges and oceans, reaching about 168 kilometers above the surface at its highest. After only 108 minutes, Gagarin and his vessel returned to Earth. He parachuted safely to the ground, several kilometers above the steppes. landing softly in a quiet field. In that moment, Gagarin became the first human ever to journey into outer space. Imagine the scene inside Vostok 1. Gagarin's voice reported calm facts. His eyes saw the receding curve of Earth, its continents bathed in morning sunlight, clouds drifting over blue seas. As the Wikipedia entry notes, Gagarin completed one orbit of Earth on April 12, 1961, with a flight lasting 108 minutes. He orbited once, re-entered the atmosphere, and gently flew by parachute down to Soviet soil. Back home, news spread. "Poyakali," Gagarin exclaimed, Russian for "off we go." He returned to Red Square a hero, but at that moment inside his ship, it was quiet except for the hum of instruments and his own breathing. Now, in this gentle recounting, we focus not on the cheering crowds, but on the serenity of his experience. Picture Gagarin strapped in his seat, looking out a porthole as Earth slowly rotates below, every detail familiar now so small. He saw polar ice caps, sprawling forests, and city lights fading behind. In our calm narrative, Gagarin's wonder becomes your own quiet wonder as you drift through space in imagination. This flight took place in the Vostok 3KA capsule, and history records that it made Gagarin the first human to reach orbital velocity around the Earth and to complete a full orbit. He truly became the first of all people to be carried around the globe by nothing but machinery and courage. As gentle now as breathing, let yourself imagine drifting behind Gagarin's Vostok capsule, some 200 kilometers up, looking down at Earth's curvature. Earth is silent from up here, its storms and winds muted below. The sun cresting the atmosphere at dawn might create a rainbow of light through his window. As he finished the loop, about an hour and 48 minutes after launch, Gagarin felt the spacecraft shudder with re-entry. Then he and the capsule parted. The capsule continued through the air, and Gagarin jumped out, descending under a small orange parachute, landing softly on grassy ground. He walked away from the capsule into a quiet world that had changed forever. But at that instant, just nothing roared or rushed. It was just the silence of a countryside morning, birds chirping as he walked to find farm workers who were the first to meet the cosmonaut. And so, in this soft description, the next chapter of the story invites you to wonder at this unprecedented silent orbit. One man alone above the world, proving by his calm presence that people could journey to the stars. Expanding the cosmos, more Vostok flights, and the first woman cosmonaut. The success of Gagarin's flight opened the spaceports to further travelers. In the quiet months after 1961, the Soviets sent up more missions on similar capsules. In August 1961, German Titov orbited the Earth for more than a full day, becoming the first person to sleep in space. In the following years, other cosmonauts like Valery Bykovsky, lasting 5 days in orbit 1963, and Andrian Nikolaev flew on Vostok missions. These flights weren't always widely publicized at home, but for our gentle history, they are threads in the tapestry of human spaceflight. One of the most famous flights of this era was Vostok 6 on June 16, 1963. That day, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman to travel into space. She orbiting Earth for nearly 3 days in her solo capsule. Space historians tell us simply, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman to travel to space on June 16th, 1963, when she orbited Earth as part of the Vostok 6 mission. From the viewpoint of our cozy narrative, imagine Valentina strapped into her capsule in the quiet darkness before dawn. Perhaps it is a spring morning, still cool. A torch of flame beneath the rocket gradually ignites, and she is gently lifted off. Within moments, she is floating in orbit. For almost 72 hours, almost 3 days, she drifted in low Earth orbit, rolling over the same ground like the others before her, talking softly over the radio about how beautiful the Earth looks from space. She conducted simple experiments and told the world that women could handle spaceflight as gracefully as men. Although her achievement was trumpeted in headlines, inside her cabin it was as tranquil as a routine mission. Imagine the feeling of resting and drifting with Earth, constantly moving below. The Space.com article reminds us she was the youngest woman ever in space and remained the only woman to make a solo journey. So far, our gentle timeline moves on. Many stories of Vostok 5 and 6, of long orbits and courageous volunteers. We could list each mission as a building block, but for now, let us keep focus on our calm thread. After Tereshkova's flight, the Vostok program concluded, but the Soviet space program shifted to an ambitious new approach, flying more than one cosmonaut at a time, and even stepping outside the spacecraft into open space. In quiet October 1964, the Soviets launched Voskhod 1. This was the first mission to carry a crew of more than one. The small capsule had been modified just enough to fit 3 cosmonauts lying sideways, no space to sit upright. On October 12, 1964, it lifted off, and soon 3 men, Vladimir Komarov, Konstantin Feoktistov, and Boris Yegorov, were orbiting Earth together. Space.com notes, on October 12, 1964, the Soviet Union launched the first multi-person mission, Voskhod 1, which launched 3 Russian cosmonauts into space. Can you picture this gently? The 3 of them cramped in silence for just about a day. They let the Earth roll by beneath them as they looked out their small portholes. We imagine their Earth below going from sunrise to sunset to sunrise, the way time blurs when you are hurtling through space. They even said a few words to each other and sang songs softly, though whether that really happened or not is debated by historians. The important part for our sleepy story is that they were alive and awake in the blackness, sharing this once impossible experience. Then came Voskhod 2 on March 18, 1965. The Voskhod 2 spacecraft carried only 2 cosmonauts, Pavel Belyayev and Alexei Leonov. Their mission included the first ever spacewalk. Imagine this chilly morning. After they reached orbit, a small airlock called Volga was inflated outside the capsule. Leonov donned a simple orange spacesuit, the first of its kind, and climbed out of the airlock. Gently floating a few meters from his ship, he became the first person to walk in space. We describe the scene in hushed tones. Leonov tethered by a cable, drifting above Earth's curved horizon, watching the blues and whites turn away as he approached the darkness. He waved his arms slowly to keep balance. For about 10 minutes he was completely alone in the void. Then a small panic arose as his suit stiffened. He had to turn the air partially out to squeeze back through the hatch. but he made it. For our story's sake, we emphasize not the drama, but the wonder. On that day, someone from Earth literally walked into space, hearing only his own heartbeat for company. According to historians, Leonov became the first human to float alone in space. He gazed down at a world unaware of its new spacewalker. That mission ended a bit rough, with the landing far off course in a snowy forest. But to the cosmonauts who were there, it felt peaceful. After landing, Belyayev walked barefoot on the snow when the rescuers arrived. Imagine the silence of that forest glade, hundreds of miles off, as two dazed but alive cosmonauts slept beneath the trees while helicopter searchlights flitted overhead. They too would go home heroes. In our gentle nighttime telling, we often skip the loudest headlines. Instead, we linger in the quiet moments, the soft whir of a valve opening, the muted countdown beeps, the gentle sway of a capsule in orbit. The Soviet space program through 1965 had given us first animal astronauts, the first human in orbit, the first woman cosmonaut, and the first spacewalker, all with astonishing swiftness. If you feel your eyes growing heavy imagining those scenes, that is just fine. Each calm description is meant to comfort and lull you, just as many of the early cosmonauts and engineers told their own children stories of the stars. Robotic pioneers, the lunar program, and the moon. Now let us ease ourselves even farther out, beyond low Earth orbit, into the silence between worlds. The Soviets were not only racing with people, but also with machines to reach the moon itself. Long before any nation set foot on the lunar surface, Soviet scientists were quietly launching robotic probes under the name Luna. In the fall of 1958, they began sending rockets with instruments toward the moon. The Wikipedia history of the Luna program tells us it achieved many firsts in space exploration. Imagine the open plains of Kazakhstan again, year 1959. Rockets waiting under stars to push through Earth's gravity. The first spacecraft of Luna 1, launched January 2nd, 1959, was supposed to impact the moon, but instead missed it, becoming the first human-made object to break free of Earth's gravity. That's a subtle achievement, drifting forever in space, carrying our message of curiosity. The world quietly noted that, and then in September 1959 came Luna 2. This time, the aim was successful. Luna 2 smashed into the moon's surface. It became the first human artifact on the moon. These probes carried nothing but metal and scientific instruments, but to dreamers on Earth they were like tiny spacecraft bearing the human name. Then, in October 1959, Luna 3 rounded the far side of the moon and sent back the first photographs of the side that no one on Earth could see. For the first time, humanity gazed upon the moon's hidden face. Imagine quiet control rooms in Moscow huddled around screens as cameras far away snapped grainy images. For us, picture instead a child looking at those black and white pictures under a lamp, feeling a gentle shiver of awe as new lunar craters appear on the paper. It was a strange calm, a silent machine far from home, doing a small thing to expand our knowledge. As the years passed, lunar probes became more advanced. In January 1966, Luna 9 softly touched down on the moon. It was the first spacecraft ever to make a gentle landing on another world. Think of how that must have been done. The probe descending under retro rockets to the dusty surface. Luna 9 then sent back panoramic photos of gray plains and fine lunar soil, rolling film through a tiny shutter. My dear lunar travelers, one might imagine a voice saying, you have now walked as softly as any spacefaring object can, without a sound on the moon. And indeed, Luna 9's landing pad was silent on touchdown, aside from the whir of its fan when closing. The historical record says Luna 9 returned 5 stereoscopic photos, tiny vistas of moonlight landscape. Luna continued with orbiters as well. For example, Luna 10 in March 1966 became the first artificial satellite of the moon. Envision Luna 10 circling high above, listening to radio commands from Earth, faithfully measuring lunar gravity variations. Back on Earth, cosmonaut students listened to the subtle hum of Luna 10's signal as proof that our machines could survive in orbit around another celestial body. This, too, felt like a lullaby, a small satellite going its rounds in perpetual motion around the silent moon. Perhaps the most poetic of the Luna missions were the sample return flights. In September 1970, Luna 16 landed and scooped up a few ounces of lunar dust and rocks, then soared back to Earth, delivering the first pristine samples since Armstrong's footprints. Imagine the delicate mechanism on Luna 16's arm gently digging into the black soil and the little return capsule being jettisoned for its journey home. It softly landed in the steppes of Kazakhstan, carrying its treasure. The historical record informs us that Luna 16, September 1970, along with Luna 20 and 24 in the early 1970s, together brought about 301 grams of lunar soil back. In our calm telling, we think of the dusty brown soil carried like a precious lullaby from the moon to Earth. These robotic steps were quiet as any nighttime breeze. Behind them lay months of planning, but in the recording instruments, no human was clapping or cheering, just circuits clicking and radio beeps. Yet with each tiny probe, humanity's footprint, or rover wheel track, on the moon's dusty plain was quietly growing. When you picture Luna 16 descending, think how that lander must have looked out its window if it had eyes, the enormous Earth shining in the black sky, tiny and blue. It did not have eyes, of course, but it left its mark. Through Luna, the Soviets claimed many more firsts on the lunar stage than they did with people. The Luna program achieved the first moon flyby, Luna 1. The first moon impact, Luna 2. The first close-up photos of the moon's far side, Luna 3. The first soft lunar landing, Luna 9. And the first robot to orbit the moon, Luna 10. Each of those events, missed impacts, secret successes, silent landings, occurred with only the quiet of radio traffic. For our sleepy story, they are marvels, gentle automatic explorers, leaving traces for us to ponder under a night sky, moon dreams, and the silent rivalry. By the mid-1960s, the moon itself became the center of the grand space rivalry. Both the USSR and the USA had ambitions to land humans on the moon. While the Americans selected Apollo for their lunar goal, the Soviets had their own designs. One thing had become clear to Soviet planners: to send people all the way to the moon They needed a new, more powerful rocket. We must speak softly as we follow this part, for it involves grand planning and then disappointments. In October 1965, Soviet engineers began testing a new giant rocket called the N1. The N1 was intended to be the counterpart to America's Saturn V rocket. Unlike Saturn V's 5 huge F1 engines, N1's first stage had an astonishing cluster of 30 engines to try to produce enough thrust. Even just looking at an N1 mock-up, observers thought it was like a forest of engines under one giant cone. The design aimed to send a two-person lunar lander and return capsule all the way to the moon in one shot. As Wikipedia explains, the N1 was planned specifically for crewed lunar missions, and its version with the lunar payload, called N1L3, was designed to compete with the United States Apollo program. In bedtime story terms, imagine the engineers and cosmonauts whispering about being the first people on the moon, even as they double-checked nuts and wires in the dead of night. But as we drift through this chapter of calm history, we must note that these hopes met harsh reality. The N1 was built in great secrecy and had very few tests. Its development was rushed and underfunded, especially after Sergei Korolev died in 1966. Ultimately, every test flight of the N1 ended in failure, each time the rocket exploded or tumbled off course shortly after launch. The Wikipedia article tells us that each of the 4 attempts to launch an N1 failed in flight. The second N1 flight on July the 3rd, 1969, is especially famous, or infamous. It blasted off on the eve of Apollo 11's journey, but just seconds later, it erupted in a colossal explosion, virtually demolishing its launch pad. A historian's notes: on July the 3rd, 1969, the mission ended just seconds after liftoff with a colossal explosion, effectively knocking down the USSR in the moon race. We pause to imagine the scene: an enormous fireball on the launch pad at Teyuratum, engineers scrambling in panic as smoke billowed. Then nearly silence, save for faint alarms and the distant echo of American achievements happening that very night. For our peaceful narrative, this is a moment of quiet, reflection rather than drama. Even in the furnace of failure, no one was hurt, but the Soviet lunar ambitions quietly faded after that. The final N1 launch attempt in November 1972 also failed, and by 1974, the program was ended. It was only many years later, with the archives opened, that people learned how close, and yet how far, the Soviets had been to a manned lunar landing. The few who knew at the time may have been heartbroken, but most in the world, and many in the Soviet Union, never heard of these misfires. Those in charge understood that Americans were likely to win this race, and they chose not to make public declarations of defeat. And of course, just a few days after that July test, on July 20th, 1969, UTC, the American Apollo 11 mission fulfilled President Kennedy's famous goal. An astronaut named Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. He quietly said the iconic words, "One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," sending them back down Earth's atmosphere. In one sense, this was the moment that closed the chapter of direct lunar rivalry. For our story's tone, Think of how softly that step was taken. No trumpets, only the gentle voices of Mission Control in Texas and the excited chatter of families gathered around TV sets thousands of miles away. The history books note that Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, and that on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. These facts we include as part of the context of our story, but from our vantage they are almost a lullaby. The sound of the moon dust disturbed on another world, yet heard only in whispers back home. From the Soviet side, how quiet was the response? In the Cold War tradition, they congratulated the United States with only a brief communique. The public in the USSR learned of it slowly, sometimes through radio, sometimes through word of mouth. Imagine an old Soviet citizen hearing about the moon landing late at night, perhaps rousing from sleep to quietly wonder at the news before falling back to gentle slumber. Meanwhile, in the silence of the USSR's space centers, engineers looked to the next tasks, launching space stations and shuttles eventually, rather than dwelling on a dream that was slipping away. The failure of their moon rocket did not feel like disaster to the average person. Life went on with the same everyday calm. The scientists and cosmonauts who remained shifted their focus to Earth orbit. But for our tale, it is a poignant end to the moon chapters. No heroes planted flags, and no human footprints remained except perhaps the spark of those dreams that now gently burn in history's annals. After the moon, quiet legacies. Having journeyed through Sputnik, Gagarin, Valentina, and Apollo, we now arrive at a softer closing scene. By the early 1970s, the Soviet space program quietly turned from racing the Americans to pursuing long-duration space travel and planetary exploration. Even as you drift off, it's worth knowing some of what came next. For example, in 1971 and the years after, the Soviets launched Salyut and Mir space stations, where cosmonauts lived for weeks or months. These were the precursors to today's International Space Station. But even those massive achievements we describe calmly. Imagine a cylindrical home above Earth, circulating many times while its inhabitants sip tea and read the newspaper, just as people at home might do on a quiet Sunday, only it's a different world outside the window. Back on Earth, space-age technology spread into everyday life. The same principles used for Soviet rockets led eventually to Soviet satellites for navigation, later GLONASS, weather monitoring, and even television. Soviet space engineers also sent uncrewed probes to Venus, the Venera program, with some success, softly bringing back pictures of that world. But those are stories for another night. For now, as you nestle deeper into rest, remember this. The pioneers we met through the tales above experienced the cosmos with wonder, not fear. They never heard loud cheering as we might imagine. Instead, their experiences were recorded in logs and data, often only quietly shared with others of their kind. Their battles were against physics and distance, and those they overcame with patience and precision. As this sleepy history draws to a close, picture once more the scene from the very start, the gentle blackness of space dotted with stars. From the launch pads of Baikonur to the calm of orbit to the silent moon, the Soviet space program wove a tapestry of firsts and dreams. These accomplishments while fuel for pride and rivalry were built step by step, often in whispered planning meetings and midnight shifts. The world of the 1950s and 60s had no internet or smartphones. Instead, it had radio transmissions, handwritten calculations, and the constant ticking of cosmic clocks. In those days without instant media, the night sky itself became a quiet messenger. Many Soviet citizens laid their heads on pillows under that very sky, hearing the occasional Sputnik whir on a crackling radio set, or reading about a cosmonaut's flight in the morning papers. Let these final thoughts cradle you. The stories we've shared are real people and events, but told as gently as a bedtime lullaby. People slept under the same stars we see tonight, finding comfort in the tiny hum of engines in orbit or the turn of an Earth below them. History remembers the dates and facts. Sputnik's launch on October 4th, 1957, Laika's flight on November 3rd, 1957, Gagarin's orbit on April 12th, 1961, Tereshkova's journey on June 16th, 1963, and the human moon landing on July 20th, 1969. But tonight, we gently recall them like soft music. You may feel your eyelids growing heavy now, as if orbiting slowly past each of these pioneering moments. If you drift asleep, that is perfectly fine. In fact, those bold souls of the past might smile upon it. They too must have fallen asleep after their own extraordinary days. In the quiet that follows, imagine the pages of this history gently closing. The fires are banked at Baikonur, the launch pads waiting for another morning. The stars continue their journey, unhurried and serene. Good night, dear listener. May the calm truths of our shared past carry you into dreams as softly as a satellite's orbit around a sleeping Earth. Sources: we have drawn on historical records and reliable accounts of the Soviet space program for every fact mentioned. For example, primary data about Sputnik 1's launch and orbit are documented. The flights of early cosmonauts, Gagarin, Tereshkova, etc., and their missions are detailed in historical archives. Space historians have recorded the lunar program's firsts and the dramatic launches of the N-1 rocket. Details about the Apollo moon landing are confirmed by NASA records. Each of these sources has been used to ensure our tale is both accurate and respectful. Sweet dreams under the stars. For decades, Russian scientists and dreamers had gazed at the night sky and imagined humans venturing beyond Earth. They were inspired by visionaries like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who had written that rockets would one day carry explorers to the stars. Slowly, those early fantasies began to take tangible shape. The Soviet space program unfolded like a gentle galaxy, with each launch a quiet starburst of hope. Engineers and dreamers in uniform and lab coats peered upward, where silent stars seemed to listen as people whispered their intentions to reach the heavens. When the first rocket engines glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, they carried a simple but powerful message into orbit. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was gently lifted off the pad. That tiny silver sphere began to circle the Earth, sending out its simple beep-beep radio signal around the globe. To those on the ground, the sound was faint, barely more than a tone, but it was heard in living rooms and radio shacks on every continent. Children built makeshift antennae to listen, and neighbors gathered in cafes to marvel at the news. Amateur radio operators in dozens of countries traded reports of the little satellite's beeps. Across time zones and ideologies, people felt in that signal a new age had quietly arrived. The machine was humble, but its achievement was profound. Humanity's first artificial moon was born. A few weeks later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 with a brave passenger aboard. Laika, a small stray dog from Moscow, was carefully placed inside a pressurized cabin. Clad in a tiny spacesuit with a little oxygen pack, she became the first living being to circle the world. For as long as the capsule allowed, Laika orbited beneath a canopy of stars. Perhaps she watched the Earth turning below, a gentle swirl of white clouds and blue oceans dotted with flickering city lights, unaware of the millions listening intently for any sign of her heartbeat. Laika's journey was brief. After one orbit, she did not return home. In her quiet flight, she made a solemn sacrifice, providing scientists with invaluable data about life in weightlessness. For years, the Soviet press described her mission in euphemistic terms, but many on the ground still told hushed stories about that little dog in orbit. In memory, Laika's voyage became a poignant symbol of courage, a reminder of the cost of exploration, as her tiny paw print found its own place among the constellations of history. Emboldened by these early successes, the engineers set out to send humans next. They added life support systems, navigation instruments, and safety features to their new spacecraft designs, preparing for a person to ride along. And soon, they would prove that people, too, could follow a dog into the sky. On April 12th, 1961, history quietly turned a page. Yuri Gagarin, a young MiG fighter pilot with a bright smile, was strapped into the capsule of Vostok 1. Before dawn, the rocket carrying him rose into the air with a soft but powerful roar. As it climbed, Gagarin was gently carried higher than any person had ever flown. Inside the small cabin, he had only a narrow porthole, not much to see through, but through that glass the world revealed itself. For about 108 minutes, he orbited the Earth once. From above, he saw the planet as a unified whole, continents, oceans, clouds, all alive with color and detail. Afterward, Gagarin would describe the view with wonder, famously saying the Earth was beautiful when he saw it from space. From down below, millions of listeners heard his steady voice aboard the spacecraft. He reported simply that everything was well, calming a rapt audience with each reassuring word. The image of Gagarin's face, peering out of a helmet under that vast sky, spread around the world. He descended back to Earth by parachute, landing softly in a remote field. That first human voyage was brief, but it changed mankind's perspective forever. Less than 2 years later, another quiet yet momentous step was taken. On June 16th, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova gently lifted off into the sky in her own Vostok capsule. Clad in a crisp white spacesuit and carrying the radio call sign Chaika, seagull, she became the first woman to fly in space. 26-year-old Valentina was a factory worker and an avid parachutist from a small village on the Volga River, an ordinary citizen now carrying extraordinary responsibility. For nearly 3 days, she orbited the Earth 48 times. From her orbiting vantage, she conducted simple medical experiments and took photographs of the cloud tops and terrain passing below. In her calm cabin, she watched sunrise chase sunset around the world. When she landed back on Earth, her return was as smooth as Gagarin's. Her success was celebrated throughout the Soviet Union. Everywhere, people admired that a young woman had bravely answered the call to space. Many Soviet girls and women saw in her a new possibility, a hope that they too could participate in humanity's greatest adventures. Valentina's voyage was a gentle triumph for equality and science alike. The frontier was pushed further still. On March the 18th, 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov made history by stepping into the void. Orbiting high above Earth in the spacecraft Voskhod 2, Leonov slowly exited through an inflatable airlock and floated into the endless black. The Earth turned serenely below him. He saw continents, the curvature of the horizon, and the thin blue line of atmosphere, while he drifted tethered only by a lifeline. It was the first time a human being had taken such a step into space. Leonov's bulky spacesuit began to inflate around him, making movement difficult. He carefully vented a little pressure to squeeze back through the hatch when the walk was over. At one point, the hatch began to close a bit too tightly, and Leonov held his breath as metal edges touched his boot, but then it sealed properly. 12 minutes after leaving the ship, he returned to the cabin. The first spacewalk had been a success, a quiet spark of human courage against the silence of space. Leonov later painted the experience and wrote that the cosmic view had filled him with awe and humility. Back on Earth, he was greeted as a hero, a symbol of how far quiet bravery could carry a man. Through all these pioneering flights rode the quiet hand of Sergei Korolev, the man behind the missions. Korolev was the chief designer of the Soviet space program, though his name was kept secret for many years. He had been building rockets since before World War II and had survived years in a Stalin-era prison labor camp, only to emerge as the mastermind of rocketry. By the late 1950s, his team had built the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik and later carried cosmonauts aloft. He oversaw every detail of the early program, from launching the first satellite and dog to sending the first men into space and planning missions to the moon and beyond. Even as he worked long nights in the design bureau, he remained calm and determined, earning the reverence of his colleagues. After Gagarin's flight, Korolev quietly continued preparing new spacecraft and stations. He spearheaded the plan for a Soviet moon landing by building the massive N-1 rocket, though that goal would not be realized before his death. Korolev passed away in 1966, but his legacy endured in every rocket and capsule that followed. Engineers would later unveil his name publicly. Today, he is remembered as the guiding genius of the first space age. By the early 1970s, those early bursts of speed above Earth were giving way to a more patient goal, to live in space for extended periods. The new dream was not just to visit orbit, but to inhabit it. To achieve this, the Soviet Union began building space stations, human outposts afloat in the sky. The first of these was Salyut 1, launched on April 19th, 1971, coincidentally timed to mark the 10th anniversary of Gagarin's flight. Salyut 1 was not flashy. It was a cylindrical laboratory about 15 meters long, launched into orbit with no crew aboard. For weeks it drifted silently, a lonely sentinel in space. Finally, a crew of 3 cosmonauts docked with it on Soyuz 11. They spent 23 days aboard, setting a new world record. Inside Salyut 1, they quietly carried out experiments, studying weightlessness's effect on their muscles and heart, measuring cosmic rays, and observing how simple plants might grow in orbit. The station held the air of a small cottage in space. Personal effects like neckties and small family photos floated in the corners. When it was time to return, all 3 cosmonauts prepared for re-entry. But tragedy struck during their descent. A valve failed and air escaped from their capsule. The radio went silent, and the world below waited anxiously, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding. The 3 men did not survive. It was a somber moment for everyone on Earth, a reminder of how dangerous spaceflight was. The station itself, Salyut 1, was later intentionally deorbited. In the hush that followed, engineers and flight directors pored over every detail to make next missions safer. Though it ended in sorrow, Salyut 1 had proven that humans could reach and temporarily dwell above our world. 2 more Salyut stations soon followed. Some of them were actually secret military spy labs covered with the Salyut name, but others were peaceful scientific outposts. In December 1974, Salyut 4 launched and hosted a powerful ultraviolet telescope. Astronomers aboard used it to study distant stars and galaxies, taking advantage of Earth's atmosphere being out of the way. Salyut 5, 1976, was another military experiment platform. And then, in 1977, came a real breakthrough, Salyut 6. This station was larger and better equipped. Crucially, it had 2 docking ports, one at the front and one at the rear. That meant a new spacecraft could arrive with a fresh crew or supplies while the old crew was still aboard. This changed everything. Salyut 6 began a string of long-duration missions with almost no gaps. Robotic progress freighters regularly auto-docked to bring up new supplies of food, fuel, air, and even mail from home. When one progress departed, it carried away spent equipment and garbage, burning up safely in the atmosphere. Life aboard Salyut 6 settled into a rhythm that might seem ordinary on Earth, but was extraordinary in orbit. The air inside was warm and recycled. The lights were dim except at workstations. Each day, cosmonauts floated from task to task. They ate from packets and cans, think stew or soups rehydrated with hot water from a tap, eaten with a spoon attached by Velcro so it wouldn't float away. Every morning, they woke to artificial lights simulating dawn. Outside, the sun would rise and set 16 times a day as the station completed an orbit. Sleeping was done, strapped into padded bunks. On the wall, like being in a hammock without gravity. There were treadmills and bikes to exercise. Without them, muscles would waste. If a leak sprung, the crew calmly donned oxygen masks and patched it with duct tape or a metal clamp, another routine fix. Even basic hygiene was turned into a task. A cosmonaut might sit in a small cubicle with one hand holding a wet wipe and the other collecting the cleaning fluid with a vacuum tube so that not a drop would float off. Yet amid the routine, wonder remained. On quiet nights, crews often floated to a window and simply stared out. They watched storms crackle over Earth, or the dazzling city lights of a great metropolis. One cosmonaut, wrote that seeing a crimson sunrise over Siberia from space felt like being part of a silent opera. They took Polaroid photos of each other, peering out at the view, a way of holding on to the marvel. Occasionally, the station crew would send a short radio message to ground, just to say good night, as if tucking the Earth into bed. Salyut 6 also became a laboratory of international friendship. Through the Intercosmos program, cosmonauts from allied nations flew aboard Soyuz spacecraft. In 1978, East Germany's Sigmund Jähn floated alongside his Soviet crewmates and performed joint experiments. A year later, Poland's Mirosław Hermaszewski joined a mission, exploring how human vision adjusted to weightlessness. Even farther away, India's first cosmonaut, Rakesh Sharma, went to space in 1984 aboard a Soviet ship, though that flight was to Mir, the next station. Each of those visits was covered proudly by their home countries. The flags of these nations were displayed inside the stations. In orbit, political borders meant little. Scientists in different languages worked on the same exercises, sometimes holding the same tethered tool. When one international visitor returned to Earth, people back home often felt a warm pride. Our country reached space, they would say. After Salyut 6 came Salyut 7 in 1982, it had even more equipment. Mirrored spacesuit lockers, new computer consoles, and improved solar arrays made it more habitable. But it too faced challenges. In 1985, Salyut 7's electronics had frozen after months of uncrewed orbit. An automated Progress supply ship kept it alive long enough for cosmonauts to fly up and fix the station. Commander Leonid Kizim and flight engineer Vladimir Solovyov packed extra tools and new circuit boards, and they docked with the silent station. Over days, they carefully opened panels and replaced fried chips, sometimes working in the dark if a short had tripped the lights. Once, they even conducted a brief spacewalk in the Heron airlock to swap out a power unit under freezing conditions. Step by step, they brought Salyut 7 back to life, as if the station itself were sleeping, and they simply woke it. When its lights finally flickered on again, ground engineers cheered. The station glowed for many more years, testament to that calm persistence. By the mid-1980s, the Salyut program had taught everything it could about long-duration space living. The next step in the quiet cosmic journey was already taking shape: Mir. On February 19th, 1986, the core module of Mir was launched. Its name, Mir, could mean peace or world, a hopeful signal that this station would be open to all humanity. Mir began with that single module, a sturdy lab about the size of a small bus. It had its own engines, solar panels, and life support. The station was complete enough to receive its first crew in March 1986. Over the next 10 years, Mir slowly grew. Additional modules docked to it one by one, each adding new capabilities. Kvant 1 was sent up in 1987 and gave Mir a pair of telescopes for X-ray astronomy and cosmic ray experiments. Kvant 2 arrived in 1989 and brought a real shower, more sleeping spaces, and an airlock for spacewalks. The Crystal Module, 1990, added materials, science labs, and solar arrays. Spectre, 1995, extended Mir's power by another set of solar wings, and Perrotta, 1996, added Earth observation research. In the end, Mir was like a small village with 5 neighborhoods in orbit. It became one of the largest and most complex human-made objects in space. Cosmonauts living on Mir called it their Dom na Nebe, a house in the sky. Inside, routines were familiar but stretched out. A crew of usually 3 would arrive by Soyuz spacecraft for a stay of several months. They followed daily schedules set from mission control, but they ate, slept, and worked as independently as possible. Meals often involved vacuum-sealed pouches that they emptied into their mouths with their tongues. Even simple spoonfuls of food floated away without lids or gravity. One cosmonaut's diary entry describes a morning coffee. He carefully held the packet, released a little liquid, and drank it through a straw to avoid crumbly mess. They even celebrated birthdays and holidays quietly. A cake would be packed up, and the crew would share it with smiles as they floated around the cabin. In Mir, personal items hung everywhere: a small Russian flag on one wall, a child's photograph on another, some trinket from Earth taped by the window. On days off, a cosmonaut might produce a guitar, some were trained musicians, and play gentle songs as Earth turned below. Each orbit brought 16 sunrises for the Mir crew. They would often find themselves staring at the morning sun peeking over the dark horizon. To them, that sunrise would come and go in under a minute. The sunsets were especially beautiful. Some cosmonauts said the skies would glow pink, purple, and gold, then quickly fade to stars. These moments of beauty gave the crew strength. They would often quickly float to the window to watch, savoring the silence. One cosmonaut later wrote that watching Earth from Mir made him feel that the whole world is one place. The boundaries and borders of Earth, so important on the ground, vanished in that orbiting perspective. Mir also became a broader space station of cooperation. By 1990, space programs in the former Soviet states and the West had started to converge. Mir hosted astronauts from Europe, the United States, Japan, and beyond. Notably, an international shuttle Mir program in the 1990s had NASA shuttles dock with Mir. During those dockings, an American astronaut would live aboard Mir as part of that station's crew. For example, in 1995, astronaut Norman Thagard spent over 3 months on Mir conducting joint experiments with the Russians, while the space shuttle Atlantis was docked to the station. These joint missions made headlines as symbols of a post-Cold War world looking up together. Cosmonauts and astronauts would float side by side in the thin air, sharing jokes and stories. Their voices carried through the quiet cabin, as if the division of Cold War had finally thinned into mere background noise above Earth. The living machines of Mir, however, also reminded everyone of human fragility. Mir was up there for 15 years, much longer than planned, and it showed its age. Twice, serious incidents rattled the station. In February 1997, for instance, a Progress supply ship misfired during docking and actually struck Mir's solar array, tearing a small hole. The crew frantically scrambled to seal the breach. Alarms wailed as the station lost some power. They donned helmets with oxygen masks and watched the stars from a safe corner until controllers fixed the problem. Another time, a loose screw caused an automatic fire sensor to trigger, and the crew had to fix a short circuit to reset it. Through it all, the cosmonauts' voices stayed calm. Decades of training had drilled them to respond steadily to emergencies. They would say on the radio things like, "We have it under control, continuing to work," as lights flickered or fans whirred into overdrive. Mir eventually was brought down safely in 2001, years after the Soviet Union ended. But during its orbiting lifetime, it proved that humans could live persistently among the stars. In parallel, another grand project was under construction on the ground, the Buran shuttle. The Soviet engineers had watched the American space shuttle program and decided to build their own reusable space plane. Buran, meaning blizzard, looked remarkably like the U.S. shuttle at first glance, but it had some key differences. On November 15th, 1988, the powerful Energia rocket thundered skyward carrying Buran on its back. After the rocket's 4 boosters burned out and fell away, Buran separated and continued into space on its own. Impressively, there were no cosmonauts on board. Buran flew entirely under computer control. For 3.5 hours, it orbited Earth, testing its systems. Then, as night fell over Kazakhstan, Buran re-entered the atmosphere and glided down to a smooth landing on a runway at Baikonur, much like an airplane. On the ground, the Mission Control Center erupted quietly. The fully automated flight and landing had been a perfect success. But that one flight was also the end of Buran's story. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the nation was in disarray. There was no money for a fleet of shuttles. The government canceled the program in 1993. The huge hangars that had housed the orbiters sat empty. In 2002, one of them tragically collapsed, destroying the single space-flown Buran in a rubble of steel. In a sense, Buran became a silent symbol of all that ambitious technology now left unused. Its massive boosters remained on display, but never roared again. The Soviets had proven they could build a mighty space plane, but the thunderous skies it would have flown in turned quiet once more. Throughout these achievements, the people on Earth watched and felt. In the Soviet Union, cosmonauts became woven into the cultural fabric. Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova were household names. Factories and universities had auditoriums named after them. Statues of helmeted spacefarers were erected along streets. Children's bedtime stories began to include journeys into orbit. Every April 12th became a national holiday, Cosmonautics Day, with speeches, concerts, and parades. Posters of rockets and starfields decorated city walls and classroom halls. And in families, space helmets and rockets became common motifs in lullabies and toys. Even as citizens dealt with everyday hardships, they could point up at the night sky and feel a quiet pride. A son or daughter from their country had been among the stars. The Soviet government, of course, had its reasons for highlighting these triumphs. Leaders like Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev touted space achievements as proof of the system's strength. They often contrasted Soviet rockets with Western problems. For example, after Sputnik's launch, Khrushchev reportedly told foreign dignitaries that this was evidence that communism was advancing into the future. Official propaganda portrayed cosmonauts as heroes forged by the socialist state, educated in state schools, strengthened by communal life, reaching feats that capitalist countries only envied. Every triumph became a badge of honor that decorated the official story of progress. Yet beneath the ceremonies, the program was kept secretive and tight. The public heard about victories, but often only whispered about failures. For example, the deaths of the Soyuz 11 crew and Komarov on Soyuz 1 were played down for years. Only the victorious signals were broadcast widely. The engineers and managers who ran the missions were careful and methodical, leaving the bravado for the speeches. Outside the Soviet Union, reactions were as varied as the nations themselves. In the developing world, many people admired Soviet achievements as a counterpoint to Western dominance. When astronauts from India, Vietnam, or Cuba took Soviet rockets, their own countries proudly followed the story. In parts of Africa and Asia, flags of the Soviet Union flew proudly on missions, showing that the USSR had a presence even on the Moon or Venus through its robotic probes. In Europe and the United States, initial reactions ranged from shock, as in 1957 there was fear of missile technology, to eventual respect. By the 1970s, foreign newspapers often covered each space launch in detail, acknowledging the scientific purpose. Many Westerners could name Gagarin, but also their own astronauts. The space race became a shared human spectacle, even as each side used it to boast. When Americans and Soviets finally shared a handshake in space during Apollo-Soyuz in 1975, commentators noted it as a hopeful sign. Even in the midst of Cold War, cooperation could bloom where two ships met above the Earth. Ultimately, the Soviet space saga carried deep lessons and symbolism. For the cosmonauts and engineers, space exploration became a profound experience of unity and humility. Veterans spoke of seeing Earth as a single, beautiful place, without borders, an image that stayed with them forever. They often said that weightlessness was strangely peaceful, forcing them to value each small action on board. Beyond the political pageantry, many cosmonauts felt they were pioneers of a new era, carrying not ideology but human curiosity and peace. Symbols were everywhere. The names of spacecraft and stations, Vostok, Dawn, Voskod, Sunrise, Mir, Peace/World, Buran, Blizzard, spoke of hope and wonder. The little dog Laika, floating among the stars, became a martyr of science. Cosmonautics was celebrated as a symbol of enlightenment, of humanity's potential, rather than warfare. Even the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which the USSR helped lead, emphasized that space is to be used for peaceful purposes. In that spirit, the Soviets sometimes highlighted their missions as gifts to humanity, like when Nikita Khrushchev at the UN referred to space as the property of all mankind, hinting that orbit was not just for the powerful. As the years passed and technology marched on, the Soviet contributions remained constant beacons. The research and stations they built laid groundwork that would later support international efforts like the International Space Station. The Soyuz capsules first developed, then became the longest flying human spacecraft design in history, transporting crews for decades. Mir became a direct ancestor to the ISS, and the stories of the early heroes, Gagarin's gentle smile, Valentina's grace, Leonov's bravery, and the unseen Korolev's vision, all became legends taught in space academies around the world. Even after the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, Russians continued to fly to space, building on that legacy as part of a broader international community. The colors of orbit had changed, but those early orbits in the twilight of the Cold War had permanently etched a pathway for the future. When sleep grows near and the night is still, one can reflect on these journeys and feel the calm they bring. Perhaps one might imagine lying on a firm bed on Earth, while far overhead a silent space station orbits. One can almost hear the faint tapping of an oxygen scrubber, or the distant beep of a long-forgotten satellite passing by. In the realm of dreams, one might even drift outside among the stars, a tethered soul floating where only rockets have gone. The story of the Soviet space program reads like a gentle lullaby for the mind, filled with humble courage and quiet wonder. It reminds us that even in darkness, small lights can guide our way, and that as long as there are brave hearts gazing upwards, the night sky carries a promise of tomorrow.